Hello, this is the Disaster Recovery Pro, and this is my video series discussing key topics in information technology with a focus on disaster recovery and business continuity. In today's presentation, we're going to take a look at the business continuity implications of the possible termination by a service provider that you rely on. What are the implications of the possibility that, say, a cloud service provider that you rely on for your critical infrastructure would suddenly terminate your account with potentially little or no notice? The solution for this problem is going to be very highly situational, so one solution isn't going to fit everybody. So the point of this presentation is going to be less about giving you answers, but more about understanding what are the questions you should be asking during business continuity planning. Just as a disclaimer, today's presentation was inspired by some real-world news events regarding a dispute over content moderation, specifically content moderation around a very hot-button political issue. We're not here to comment on the politics of the situation or to take sides one way or the other, or even judge who is right and who is wrong in this situation from a service provider contracts perspective. The event I'm referring to does highlight that a service provider may terminate service unexpectedly in some situations, and that there are risks associated with it that can be devastating to a business, especially a smaller business. So we're going to step back from the context of the situation and just focus in on how do you manage that risk. And in the spirit of not taking sides, we're not going to mention the names of either of the parties involved in that event, and keep this generic and high level as much as possible. So let's build our hypothetical scenario here. We'll start with hypothetical company XYZ. Their product is a website and an associated mobile application. And company XYZ has constructed the backend for their product on a public cloud service, and let's call that public cloud provider Company ABC. And in our simplified architecture diagram here, you can see that Company XYZ is using services such as load balancing, server-based and serverless-based processing, object storage, and database services. Some of these components, most likely the serverless functions and possibly the databases and object storage layer, are probably proprietary services with the cloud provider. If the cloud provider provides some sort of front-end services such as content delivery networks, those are most likely used as well, even if they're not on the diagram. Company XYZ is also likely using some of Company ABC's replication and redundancy features. This architecture is most likely mirrored at a different geographical location as well, possibly using features such as auto-scaling for the server and serverless components, and possibly straight-up replication for the object storage and database components. One of the big selling points for an architecture like this, and for a cloud provider in general, is that you can do this replication within the cloud provider's services itself and not have to have a secondary or tertiary recovery site to provide additional resiliency and disaster recovery capabilities. Those capabilities can be, and usually are, baked into the very architecture of a service that you design on a cloud provider, and again is one of the main attractions of a cloud provider as opposed to an on-prem or physical implementation. Let's walk through a hypothetical worst-case scenario where the business relationship between Company XYZ and the provider Company ABC breaks down entirely. So our scenario starts where Company ABC has objections to certain content that's posted on Company XYZ's services. And we'll assume that the contract between the two parties has some duties towards content moderation included in it. These kind of clauses are actually fairly common, and they're designed to protect the service provider's reputation from fallout over something that one of their clients did on their platform. Let's also say that Company ABC, our service provider, doesn't feel that Company XYZ's moderation policies are sufficient to protect Company ABC's brand from reputation damage. The service provider, Company ABC, demands action from Company XYZ, their client, who has a contractual obligation to act in some capacity, and the negotiations to try and resolve this disagreement do not go well. As negotiations continue to break down, Company ABC just gives Company XYZ 24 hours to comply, or they'll terminate service, claiming that their client is in breach of contract, which they may very well be. Maybe company XYZ is arguing back that they did comply or are making fair efforts to comply, but company ABC disagrees and terminates service immediately on, say, 24 hours notice without a typical cure period to resolve issues or a longer notice period of termination. Most contracts say we'll give you 30 days to find a new host. But the point is, the service provider takes the position that the breach of contract warrants an immediate termination rather than giving any sort of notice. The end result is that customer XYZ now faces the prospect of a long downtime period while they try to find a new provider, whether it's a cloud provider or a physical hosting provider. They likely have to redesign parts of their infrastructure that are dependent on proprietary features, and effectively they'll have to rebuild their entire back-end infrastructure. They may be in such dire circumstances that they may have to resort to legal action in order to survive, as they are just down and out of business without any time to pivot to another solution before their back end is just shut off. And there's also a very serious opportunity cost at play here, because customer XYZ is now losing any potential new customers they were gaining during this restructuring period to their competitors. And that's a damage that's very hard to quantify in dollar amounts, but it may still be the factor that determines if your business is going to be able to survive. So when we think about this hypothetical business relationship and the hypothetical chain of events that led to its termination, we should be able to find a lot of lessons learned that we can apply to business continuity planning. And as we discussed before, we're not necessarily going to come up with answers, but we can at least talk about what are the right questions to be asking ourselves. Does your cloud provider provide contractually obligated notice periods for termination for cause or otherwise? Can you trust that the provider will abide by these terms, or do they have an out clause they can use to bypass the notice period? Maybe there's tricky wording they can use, like if they use the term suspension versus termination, does that give them an out? Do you clearly understand all the implications of your terms of service agreement? There may be compliance obligations that are not obvious on the surface that can be used as legal justification to terminate service on short notice. Are you able to meet your legal obligations as defined in the provider's terms of service, and are those terms clear-cut or open to broader interpretation? And these first 2 points are really important. You really do have to examine and understand your contracts and service agreements with your service providers in order to understand and assess the risks associated with those contracts. Do you have contingency agreements with alternate providers in place that you can quickly pivot to in an emergency? And are those agreements legally ironclad enough to withstand potential peer pressure from market competitors? You do have to be aware that service providers may talk to each other, and one service provider may say, hey, you don't want to deal with customer XYZ, they're bad people. And that pressure can have a very real effect on business relationships. And while this would be considered tortious interference in most legal jurisdictions, it can still cause a lot of damage before you have the opportunity for relief. Since we are talking about risk, we do have to account for the risk that in any business relationship, one or both parties may or may not act in good faith. While most business relationships are conducted honestly, a bad actor on either side of a business relationship can cause a lot of damage to one or both parties, so it should be considered in a risk analysis. On a more technical front, you need to consider what is the level of effort required to transition off proprietary features. Do your recovery plans cover the possibility of having to translate some of these items to a different proprietary service or back to a more traditional server-based implementation where you build it yourself on your own infrastructure? Knowing that level of effort is going to determine what the potential damages of a sudden termination are. Another technical or more disaster recovery-oriented consideration is, do you have complete backups of all your services and data to somewhere that's outside of your cloud service? Or are you replicating data somewhere outside of your cloud service that you can leverage for recovery? Do you have complete, detailed documentation of your environment and the process to recover it stored somewhere off-platform as well? It's not just do you have the data to do your recovery, do you have the procedures to perform that recovery off-platform as well? If you store your recovery procedures and their documentation of what the environment's supposed to look like within your cloud service, well, when that cloud service gets turned off, you're just as dead as you would be if you didn't have those things at all. And finally, do you have insurance coverage that may help with the financial impact of a sudden termination? Is this something that your contingent business interruption insurance or supply chain interruption insurance would cover? In many cases, it may not. In most cases, those policies hinge on physical property damage to a business partner or supply chain partner, which is not the case in a scenario like this. Just like when we were talking about contracts and terms of service, you also have to be very aware of the terms of your insurance policies as well, know what it does and doesn't cover. So in conclusion, I think we can sum up the lessons learned into 3 major high-level bullet points. Do you clearly understand your terms of service agreements and their legal implications? Have you considered the potential breakdown of a key business relationship in your risk assessment and business impact analysis? And can your technical recovery plan still function effectively without that service provider? These are what I feel to be the key high-level questions you need to ask yourself in order to address the business continuity impact of the potential loss of a service provider due to business relationship breakdown. Thanks for watching today's presentation. If you found this topic interesting and you want to learn more about disaster recovery and business continuity, you can help support the channel by leaving a comment to tell me what you thought about it, clicking like on the video, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so that you won't miss out on my next video. Your support and feedback is very important, so thank you for watching and supporting the channel, and have a great day.